Thank you all. Thank you for coming this evening. You know, it's amazing whenever you have a philosopher speak, there's always a buzz in the crowd and you never quite get people to shut up. They actually want to keep talking and talking and discussing things. We have philosophers of all ages here, from the older to the very young, so many philosophers. And we're very fortunate to have Professor Peter Redpath this evening, who has a long, distinguished career as a scholar and teacher of philosophy. He's the rector of the Adler Aquinas Institute and tutor at Harrison Middletown University in Tempe, Arizona. He serves as managing editor of the philosophical book series and executive editor of the Adler Aquinas Institute special series in philosophy from the Socratic Press. Former professor of philosophy at St. John's University in Staten Island, Professor Redpath has taught philosophy at the college and university level, as I said, for over 44 years, and is author and editor of 11 books. He's president and co-founder of the International Etienne Gilson Society, former vice president of the American Maritime Society, chairman of the board at the University of Western Civilization, was a former associate editor of the Contemporary Journal, or the Journal of Contemporary Philosophy, where he remains a current advisor, residing with his wife in Lorraine and Cape Creek, Arizona. What he's going to talk about, what this book addresses, is something which is extremely important for our times. In classical antiquity, we saw rising crescendo from Socrates through Plato to the genius of Aristotle and his metaphysical insights, followed by precipitous fall into Stoicism and Epicureanism and latter-day cynicism. After a century and a half of great philosophy, the genius of Aristotle was lost almost overnight. A millennium and a half later, in the High Middle Ages, scholasticism went from Albertus Magnus to Thomas Aquinas, and in a half century of metaphysical prowess, we saw with the decline of the Nominalism of Duns Scotus and William Ockham. In 3/4 of a century, the genius of Aquinas was lost almost overnight. When Descartes and later Kant spoke of scholasticism, they didn't turn to Aquinas' genius, they turned to Nominalism. Western civilization lost its intellectual glory. If you look at the metaphysics section of any modern bookstore, other than the CIC, you find books on palm reading and spiritism. In his monumental work before us here, Professor Redpath seeks to reestablish in an initial way the essential connection between philosophy and science and wisdom that started to become centuries ago around the time of the birth of modern science, as I described in this sort of loss, really, of the genius of the great Aristotle. Because this main volume entails reuniting in an initial way most contemporary intellectuals claim are two distinct natures, Professor Redpath precisely explains what is the single nature of philosophy and science, and how it appear to be two distinct natures are actually one. Towards this end, he re-examines the general history of philosophy and science from the ancient Greeks to the present day. And as he engages in the study, he radically reinterprets the nature of philosophy and science, universals, and analogy. He challenges commonly received scholarly opinions about the origin and the nature of one, the problems of the one and the many, and universals, and the nominalism, which I've mentioned. So please join me in welcoming Professor Redpath.
Thank you very much. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here tonight, and a most humbling experience. Part of the reason it's an honor for me is because Scott Block's partner in crime, Father C. John McCloskey, has been a good friend of mine for years, and I would come to see him periodically here at the center in D.C. while he was here. It's a humbling experience because, as Father was going over some of the activities in which I've been involved for the last 30 or 40 years, I started to think of the great experiences that I've been able to have, to meet people, to travel with people, to converse with some of the greatest intellects of our time, both Catholic and non-Catholic. to travel with Scott Bloch in Poland, and Richard Fafara, who was here, studied at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, to have friends at the Pope John Paul the Second Catholic University of Lublin, to be able to work with Mortimer Adler to set up the Angelicum Academy and Great Books Academy homeschool programs, to be able to travel to Rome, meet Pope Benedict, to sit out at the Angelicum in Rome overlooking the seven hills of Rome, drinking wine, being serenaded at Mont Saint-Michel, traveling to Venice, with spending time with Paul Oscar Christoa for a couple of weeks while I was there, having people like Ralph McInerney and Jude Doherty and Father James Shaw as friends. All of that is such a terrific experience, and I was thinking that even with all of these things that I've been involved in and done, that looking at it all you here tonight, I know that the thing for which history is most going to remember me, or probably the only thing for which they're going to remember me, is that I'm the father of Paul and Peter Redpath. Because I know that, for the most part, it's due to my sons that most of you are here. So I will try not to let them down, embarrass them in front of such a distinguished audience. And my son Peter, he tries, well, both of them are very protective. That's one of the reasons why they sit close to me, especially if I'm going to lecture. And Peter warned me, he said, "Dad, remember, you're in the chapel." Because every once in a while, my Brooklyn background comes out. And so most of the time it does, but I get a hostile audience at times. I have to, just. Plus I had the Zavarian brothers in high school, and you take the combination of those two, you put them together, and you can never tell what's going to happen. What I'd like to do in the short period of time I have to talk to you is just go over the background of how I got involved in this work. What prompted me. Before I do that, I have to explain something about the title. A Not So Elementary Christian Metaphysics. Peter said to me a couple of days ago, "Dad, the title of the book, do you think that some people might find that a little arrogant? You know that there was this father, Joseph Owens, at the University of Toronto, who wrote an elementary Christian metaphysics." I said, "Yes, Peter, I see that the title's an inside joke. If you knew Father Joseph Owens, first of all, you know that his elementary Christian metaphysics is not elementary. And to distinguish it from his, if that's elementary, my work is not so elementary. Plus, Father Owens is, he's very much like Father Shaw. You don't want to compare yourself. These people are species unto themselves. Owens is just a frightening man to talk to, because you had the sense when you did talk to him, Tim Newton's shaking his head back there, that he was bilocating. He was somewhere else while he was with you, and you could just ask him a question about anything, and you knew where it was, citations, he could tell you the page number, the location on a page in text. Now, nonetheless, the work is ambitious. It attempts to reunite philosophy and science and wisdom in an initial way. And the reason I got into this was because of the influence of several people on me. One was Jacques Maritain. And a couple of works that Maritain wrote that I was reading in the mid-1980s. I've actually been working on it. I had this project in mind since the 1980s when I was doing an article for a volume called Understanding Maritain, Philosopher and Friend, that was edited by Bill Hudson and Matt Mancini a long time ago. And as I was reading, I came across, I was reading The Peasant of the Garonne, and I came across a passage by Maritain in which he said, he begged his readers not to take the statement he was going to make as that of a crazy old man when he claimed that modern subjective idealists were not philosophers. Now, I disagree with Maritain on a number of issues. I think it's easier very often to read St. Thomas to understand Maritain than it is to read Maritain to understand St. Thomas. But nonetheless, even when I disagree with him, I always will respectfully listen to him because he has these flashes of genius and that lead you usually to some nugget of that you never would have seen if it weren't for him. And he also said that modern philosophy, this subjective idealism, was secularized theology. Now, before he had said that, I'd actually come to that conclusion. Before I read that there was some sort of secularized theology that these people were involved in. Then I saw Gilson. I think it was in the Unity Philosophical Experience where he talks about the subjective idealists not being philosophers. I was reading Mortimer J. Adler, This Pre-War Generation, and God and the Professors. And Adler was complaining about how in the 1930s, and at the beginning of America getting involved in World War II, how the American students, as a result of their professors, were largely sophists and could not defend the principles of Western culture against the onslaught of Nazism and communism. These people talking in this way led me to conclude that there was something to what Maritain said. And so I went back and I started to research this, and I concluded that Maritain was right, that Descartes was not a philosopher. He called them idiosophers. I call them transcendental sophists. Transcendental Thomism being a kind of transcendental sophist. But as I was working on this, I said, well, if he's right, and I noticed something else too. I noticed that the major thinkers that I respected within Thomism, Gilson, Maritain, Father Maurer, Father Owens, all understood philosophy as done by the ancient Greeks to start with sensation. Gilson, in his Thomist realism and the critique of knowledge, or his methodic realism, I forget, says that sense wonder is the first principle of philosophy for all time. Not just, for this period of time, or that period of time, but for all time. I wrote a series of books in the 1990s related to this, this theme, trying to show how Descartes was not strictly speaking, was not a philosopher, and how all of the ancient Greeks were sense realists. I started out with this work called Cartesian Nightmare, and then did a work called Wisdom's Odyssey from Philosophy to Transcendental Sophistry, showing how this was the case, that you had this philosophical realism. And as I was going over this, I concluded, one of the problems that we have in the West today that prevents us from reuniting philosophy and science is that we tend to think that somehow or other philosophy entered the Middle Ages. And I claim, no, it never really did. At least not before around the 13th century. What passed off as philosophy was actually Christian theology. And Gilson had made a mistake. Now, I have a lot of evidence. You know? I never make claims that where I don't have mountains of evidence, usually to support what I'm saying. I just want to read you something here from a scholar you'll be familiar with. Just a short passage where talking about St. Augustine, who, you know, philosophy entered the Middle Ages. It entered with St. Augustine, if it took a foothold. Right? He says, the Philosophia Christiana that St. Augustine talks about is nothing less than theology or Christian doctrine, preached today as the Catholic religion. Then in a footnote to that passage, he says, it's useless to read into St. Augustine's use of Philosophia Christiana any 20th century implication of a Christian philosophy distinct from revelation of theology in the scholastic sense of the term. It means nothing more or less than a lived Christian faith. Now, that was Cardinal Ratzinger, who is James Father Weishaupt, has this included in a work called Philosophy and the God of Abraham. So that's just one of the supporting pieces of evidence. The other is a work by Ernst Robert Curtius, European literature in the Latin Middle Ages, where Curtius talks about by the 4th, 5th century A.D., there were like 6 or 7 competing definitions of philosophy. And none of which really corresponds to what the ancient Greeks were doing. That enters into the later Middle Ages. What actually tends to take a foothold in the Middle Ages is this notion that philosophy is the liberal arts, or liberal arts as a handmaiden to theology. And it's not till around the 13th century that St. Thomas discovers that's wrong. That's a mistake. So if we want, my point is, if we want to reunite science and wisdom, then what we have to do is first of all understand what strictly speaking philosophy means, and how the ancients understood it. If we don't do that, precisely because up until the beginning of the 20th century, these terms are used synonymously. So if we're wrong about our understanding of philosophy, in some way we've got to be wrong about our understanding of science. And I think that the reason that Western culture is in such a mess today is precisely because we've lost our understanding in the West of what is meant, strictly speaking, by philosophy and science. In 1947, Jacques Maritain gave a presidential address to UNESCO in Mexico City for a conference dealing with the formation of UNESCO. And in that talk he gave, he had 5 topics that he addressed. One was absolute sovereignty. 2 was the natural law. 3 was realpolitik. 4 was Babelism. And 5 was reuniting science and wisdom, especially in relationship to technology. And he claimed that if we didn't do this, okay, there was no way in which we could end global war in the future. Okay? The Babelism, and I think he was talking about, is sophistry, and the realpolitik is power politics. One of the reasons I was interested in going and doing this research about Maritain and Descartes was to figure out, well, an answer to this question, how you reunite philosophy and science. At about the same time that Maritain wrote that article, Etienne Gilson wrote an article that was published by St. Michael's College called The Terrors of the Year 2000. It was a great article in which Gilson talks about, and I think he wrote this actually with Maritain somewhat in mind. Because Maritain had thought that going back to the Peace of Westphalia, a notion of sovereignty had entered the West, which was more or less a transfer of the divine right of kings to the divine right of states. Might makes right. And Maritain claimed it's totally incompatible to hold that doctrine, especially after the Holocaust, or World War II, and claimed that you are a natural law theorist, that they're contradictory opposites. So you'd have to modify the teaching on sovereignty. Now, I think that now there were a number of people that were involved in this. Robert Hutchins was also involved in this movement to modify the notion of sovereignty and to figure out some way to prevent a global war from happening. Gilson was involved in it. Gilson was also involved in the San Francisco conference with Maritain to form the UN. Maritain had received from Paul VI at the close of the Vatican II, where he led it to intellectuals, showing his importance in the work that he was doing in relationship to a number of things, including this world peace. Adler was involved in it, and I think what happened, what I'm trying to do here, this book is not a book strictly speaking about metaphysics. It's about the relationship between metaphysics and culture, metaphysics and civilization, especially Western civilization, and how Western civilization is in decline chiefly because if you lose your faith in the first principles, the metaphysical first principles upon which you're founded, then your culture is going to decline. You can't possibly, anybody that's studied the history of civilizations or cultures in the West knows this to be the case. I'm not telling this as news to anybody who's studied Western history. But I think what happened, or what this creed Gilson calls the Western Creed and the unity of philosophical experience. We've lost our faith in the Western Creed, including the eminent dignity of man, and unless we recover it and recover our understanding of philosophy and science and how they can be unified, then our culture is not going to recover from our current situation. I think what happened to this program that Maritain and Gilson and Hutchins and Adler were involved in the 1940s was that in the 1960s it got hijacked in universities. And instead of modifying the notion of sovereignty, there were utopian socialists who decided that they wanted to destroy the notion of sovereignty entirely by changing and deconstructing national constitutions. And I think that's been at work since that time, and it's really moved into full gear in our own period of time. A lot of people have recognized, a lot of scholars have recognized that the fight that we're involved in the West now, and Gilson recognized this in the Terrors of the Year 2000, is that the fight is not between the West and other cultures. It's between the modern West and the ancient West. And there's a kind of a hatred for classical civilization that's rooted in the Enlightenment. In this article, Gilson talks about how toward the tail end of World War II, after the bombing of Hiroshima, science had made its greatest discovery. or a shocking discovery, I forget which ways he puts it, namely that to know has come to mean, we've wrested this from matter, he said. To know means to destroy. Right? Now, when I read that, I said, wow, this is very interesting, for a number of reasons. I said, this sounds like Maritime's warning about Machiavellianism. Right? And I started to think, you know, the more I look at philosophical, the more I look at the popular understanding of science today, especially in positivism, but not only in positivism, with respect to people who tend to identify science with mathematical physics, was that there's a kind of cosmic despotism in this. For years, as I was going through doing the research into what the ancients were doing in philosophy, I was trying to figure out what is it, precisely what is it that is the test for the fact that someone is actually practicing science. And the more I got into this, the more you'll have people who are in the practice talk about empirical verification, which no longer works, because of the fact that there are behaviors of entities that are not observable, even in principle. And the fact that verification is an act of the intellect. It's not an act of the senses by itself. It's only to the extent that you use sense evidence as a premise, in syllogistic reasoning, that you can say that you're engaged in scientific reasoning. So I decided that there was something wrong with that understanding, and that the mistake, as Maritain pointed out, happened with Descartes. Now, precisely where did it happen? Well, Descartes moves truth out of the intellect, even though he's famous for saying that truth lies in a clear and distinct idea. Right? Strictly speaking, truth for Descartes lies in a strong will, the ability to stabilize your imagination, so that when you're viewing things, you do so in a fashion that they don't move on you, and you can see them clearly. So that's one of the theses of the book. That one of the things that Descartes did is he took the will. He took truth and he moved it out of the intellect. In addition, strictly speaking, he has no intellect. He talks about himself as a mind, but what he means by a mind is a multitude of ideas that are connected together in some way by relationship to the idea of God, namely through this clear and distinct idea that he has of himself as a thing which thinks. And he's a nominalist. Right? In fact, all of the subjective idealists are nominalists. Right? Now, how can you possibly get science out of nominalism? This makes no sense. So I tried to figure out, well, let me take a look at St. Thomas, see what St. Thomas says about science. And as I did so, I started to see that for St. Thomas, there's such a thing as a formal object. In fact, that in the Summa Theologia, Part 1, Question 7, his response to Article 7 of Question 1. He's talking about the subject of a science, and he says the subject of a science is related to a science like the formal object is related to a faculty or a habit. Now, that was puzzling. Huh? That's a puzzling passage. And I couldn't understand it that clearly when I was trying to deal with what does he mean by a subject and what does he mean by a formal object. Until I reread Plato. Right? Father Shaw loves Plato. Recommends that you read it, especially the Gorgias. Is a wonderful work to read. And the Republic, the Meno. But Socrates engages in this discussion with Thrasymachus in Book 1 of the Republic about whether or not justice is the advantage of the ruler or the advantage of the ruled. And at one point, Thrasymachus tells Socrates, to go get a nurse to help him wipe his nose because he thinks that rulers are actually concerned for the welfare of sheep rather than for their own personal benefit. Huh? And here occurs, as far as I can see, if not the first, one of the first instances of what scholastics, St. Thomas will call per se predication. Socrates turns to him and says that strictly speaking, or speaking propriate ita, strictly speaking for Semicus, the ruler rules for the benefit of the rule. And he's not a money maker, okay? Because the chief reason for ruling for the money maker is to make money. They're coming from two different sources. So I just thought, oh, I see. The formal object has to activate the faculty, like St. Thomas will say color activates the eyes, makes them act. Sound activates the ear. And so science has to have this kind of formal object where you have some sort of faculty in a human being activated, or habit being activated. Now, the subject of a science for St. Thomas is threefold, actually. It involves, and Father Maurer talks about this. He's one of the people that have had an influence me on in this book. In fact, I don't think I wrote this book, actually. It's one of the reasons why I feel confident about it. That it's good. I'm very good at synthesizing stuff. I've been doing this since I was in my 20s. I never read people just by themselves. I always read them together. Tried to put them in conversation with one another. And after a while, I just see people, other people. People talk to me, and I'll hear somebody else. I know that. I've heard that before. Where did that come from? Father Maurer says that the subject of science actually involves the matter being studied, the method, and the aim. Yeah. Right? Now, one of the things that Descartes does is he takes habits out of the human knower. For him, human being is just a train of ideas that's somehow unified by a strong will. Well, where do you get a formal object from if you have no faculties or habits? How do you explain how the individual knower knows, how the individual knower possesses science, if you've got no formal object? Especially when you're dealing with practical knowledge. For example, the formal object of the physician is to heal. Right? How do you connect? How do you connect the knowledge of the physician? It's the knowledge of the physician acting on the relatively healthy body that can be healed that creates science. Well, if you have no principle of knowing in the individual knower, how's that an individual act? How do you connect the knowledge of this physician and explain? Now, to me, a scientist should do several things. A scientist should be able to tell you the subject matter that the person's studying, the principles of the subject, how that person gets the principles, and why they work. Now, I claim that, strictly speaking, nobody in contemporary science can explain that to you. If they hold on to this popular understanding, say, of positivism, or that mathematical physics and science are identical, that they run into this problem. So, say you want to say, well, it's a team effort. Well, you still got the problem of the team. I mean, how's the team going to work together? The formal object, it can be considered in a receptive sense. Like, you've got the power of sight being activated by color. That's formal object. It can also be considered from the standpoint of the habit, or the faculty, where you're reacting. So the power of sight, when activated by color, sees. That's the end, in the sense of medicine, for example. Right? Now, if you cut out the faculty of seeing, the power of sight, the habit of seeing from the individual knower, how do you explain how this individual sees? You sever the relationship. I read this marvelous passage by Etienne Gilson in a terrific work of his called Painting and Reality. And Gilson is great at giving you these gems, like Maritain. Father Maurer does the same thing, where he says that the only way to unify a multitude is to order it. I said, oh, that's quite interesting, you know, because you find that it's a very popular notion in physical science today that people parade around like peacocks in the physical sciences and claim that there's no aims in things, no ends. Huh? Now, when Aristotle was talking about aims and ends, he wasn't talking about purposes. Frank Slade, great teacher from St. Francis College in Brooklyn, was a friend of Father Sokolowski. Sokolowski's always talking about Slade and how brilliant he is. Wrote an article about this, I forget where it's published, but that purposes ends are not purposes. Purposes are ends, or aims, but not the other way around. Now, if ends or aims do not exist within a multitude, there's no way to transform that multitude into parts of a whole. Now, all of science studies part-whole relationships. You deny the existence of ends and aims and things, there's no way you can explain part-whole relationships. In fact, there's no way you can consider relationships real. Consider this. Consider the members of a baseball team, you know, like the third baseman, second. And you ask that person, well, what are you doing here? Well, I'm playing third base. Well, what does a third baseman do? Well, I catch the ball. You know, I catch the ball, I throw the ball. To whom? I don't know. For what reason? I don't know. No purpose, no aim. How do you know what you're doing? How do you know what you're doing? How can you be part of a whole that's engaged in the performance of one act? If a person made this claim in something like baseball, we'd say this person's ridiculous. Or if somebody was a fireman, did the same thing. Why are you here? What are you doing? I don't know. We've got no aim. Nothing. Well, how can you be a member of a whole? Now, it's essential to any kind of scientific activity is part of a relationship. So, with that, there's no aim, there's no habits, there are no internal faculties, and the subject known in a nominalistic world has no relationships between things that are universal or necessary. The individual exists in classical nominalism, like in Occam or in Protagoras. Well, there might be something outside your mind. Protagoras can influence it by his gift of speech and transform it. Occam says, well, universals are occultly produced in the mind, but all that exists is the individual outside. So in a nominalistic world, all relationships become fictional. Is it any wonder that the people that hold on to this kind of a view live in a fictional world? If you have no principle of unity within a thing, what are called forms, there's another thing that's celebrated. And there are forms in things, the physical things in the modern scientific universe, except maybe mathematical forms, like John Locke will say primary qualities exist in things, but not secondary qualities like color, figure and shape and number and so forth. They're real, and those relationships are real. But, as Bishop Berkeley says, well, hey, how do you know what primary qualities are? You don't know the secondary qualities. If substances don't exist, how do you explain real relationships? If all you have is accidental characteristics that exist, how do you explain real relationships? Where is necessity? In other words, if you take those characteristics of a formal object that St. Thomas identified, they're all gone from modern physical science. And what are you left with? You're left with this notion that science is a system. It's a logical system of ideas. Now, Descartes comes out of this Jesuit education, which is heavily influenced by Italian Renaissance humanists. Now, one of the problems that a lot of Thomists have is that they, first of all, don't tend to read Plato. They don't read the Renaissance humanists, the Italian humanists especially, and they don't read Rousseau. Now, a lot of people recognize that for Descartes, there's the problem of trying to explain communication between substances. He thinks that there's some kind of substance that he knows outside his mind, but he considers it inert. It's not active. So he can't explain how it can act on the mind and make him know it. He thinks that God has implanted in his mind this system of clear and distinct ideas, and that he can come to know it through the strength of his will. Now, in saying that, what Descartes is doing is he's actually, see, my claim is that Descartes comes out of the Italian humanist tradition. All right? It's very popular among the Italian humanists, going back, starting with Petrarch, who were the Italian humanists who were trying to dislodge the influence of scholastic theology from Catholic education, from universities, and to elevate their status, to claim that there was a true philosophy, an esoteric philosophy, that was hidden, it was buried in the texts of poets, because they want to read the pagan poets. And at the tail end of the Renaissance, rhetoric and poetry. Poetry is studied within rhetoric. And it's up until that time, it's more or less considered the Cinderella of the liberal arts. Why? Because they're reviving literacy in the West. So grammar comes first, 8th and 9th century, 10th and 11th century, up to the 12th, logic, Peter Abelard, William of Champeau, and all of these things going. John of Salisbury, I think. These debates go on. And just when they're coming into ascendancy, you got Aristotle entering the West. And they're robbed, and especially at the University of Paris, the undergraduate school of liberal arts. And they can't stand this that's going on. They especially hate Averroes, the commentator on Aristotle, who also thinks that philosophy is a hidden teaching that is buried in the Quran. Actually, it's the only philosophers who know how to read the Quran. According to Averroes, there's a group of people down and below on the bottom. They're the poets. Petrarch hates this. How could he possibly be poets? Down is the lowest level. Then above them are the dialecticians and the theologians, and then the philosophers up top. He's going through Plato's divided line here. Now, the Renaissance humanist movement, there's a condemnation in 1277, which Gilson says, condemnation issued by the Bishop of Paris under the auspices of Pope Peter of Spain at the time. Which Gilson says brought the Middle Ages, a high point of the Middle Ages, to an end. And then you have this ascendancy of a mindset which seeks to bring into the West an Aristotle that's not dangerous to the faith, and it's mainly led by Augustinians. And this Augustinian movement goes back to Augustine, actually, and even before Augustine, to a passage that Augustine apparently gets from St. Ambrose, an idea about philosophy, that it's a hidden teaching that actually is nothing else other than the religion that was given by God to Moses and that was stolen, or to which I should say the Christians should have property. Right? And Petrarch will pick this up, and he'll argue and pass this on to leading Renaissance scholars that there's this esoteric tradition. There are actually two schools of philosophy. One that developed among the Italians. Right? In fact, even before they came on to this, the Jews in Alexandria were being criticized for being culturalist barbarians. This was before Christianity comes on the scene. And they were arguing against the Greeks And the Romans were accusing him of this, you stole your philosophy from the Jews. And it's nothing other than deconstructed Jewish theology. Sir Isaac Newton actually adheres to this understanding of science. He thought he was a descendant of the Magi. He was born on Christmas Day. And he thought that God left clues around the universe for you to be able to. Cambridge wouldn't even allow his theological writings to be made public until the 1960s. And when I think Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith got his hold on a bunch of them, and his hands on a bunch of them. So Descartes thinks this. God is a hidden system, teaching, but he's trying to take away from the poets. He said he doesn't like the poets. The stuff of poetry now, he studies with the Jesuits. That's the garbage. The stuff that's really good. That's the logic. Right? Philosophy is logic, but it's got to be enlightened logic, systematic logic. Right? And he thinks Maritain got this great book on the dream of Descartes, where he talks about how Descartes thinks he's going to unite the whole of the sciences. And unite. He's got this encyclopedia as part of that, right? And he's got this book of poetry, this dictionary, a lot of that. He's going to bring the two of them together. So I go, look, Descartes not influenced by Suarez, even though he's the major thinker. His understanding of philosophy is this. It's a hidden teaching. Now, Rousseau recognizes that Descartes can't explain communication between substances. Right? So he says obscure ideas are real. They're true. Right? Just like clear ones are. And science is not some sort of a system that's been given complete in the soul. It historically evolves and progresses through the idea of tolerance. Right? You come into conflict with your emotions. You project your emotions, come into conflict with your emotions in 3 stages. Right? You go from this kind of poetic stage, you might say, where you just kind of have liberty and so forth, and it's unbridled. And then you progress to this civic stage, right? A moral stage, and then finally you progress to this final stage of a civic being. Now I claim he's taken Averroes. Right? He got influenced by Averroes. He took Petrarch somehow or other. Now Gilson says this in Reason and Revelation in the Middle Ages, a passage that Father Shaw sent me. That's what he's doing some work, just happened to say, oh, this is great, I need this. That there's a direct line from Averroes to the rationalism of the 18th century, 17th, 18th century. And I said, well, it's Rousseau. Right? And what Rousseau does is he takes the notion of there being one intellect for the entire human race, and he combines it with Descartes' notion that truth no longer is in the intellect, it's in the will. But it's not in completely given there. It's in strong will that grows and develops. And there's one social will. For Averroes, there's one social intellect, and this becomes the general will. So what we're fighting against in the modern world, in the modern notion of science, there's a metaphysics that underlies modern science. It's metaphysics that always underlies science. And I claim that what it is Neo-Verism. And unless we understand that, we don't understand the enemy. When I finished this book, I started to think, well, there must be some way I can explain to people what this understanding of science is. Right? And I finally came up with it. That it's socialistically enlightened. This is the popular understanding. It's socialistically enlightened and mathematically restrained and measured efficiency of will. In other words, I prove to you that I'm scientific because I can destroy things. I can build things. I can use mathematics to do it. I read that passage and I said, oh my God, that's polis. he's talking to Socrates in the Gorgias. And he's telling Socrates, hey, Socrates, Socrates is saying, is Archelaus really a happy man? Is he powerful? And he says, yeah, look what he can do. You know, he can kill anybody who wants to use. Socrates says, how about I told you I found this magnificent weapon, and I can take it, and I can use it for anything. A dagger. Well, Socrates says, well, look, you know, what happens if you're a fool? But you don't know how to use this technology. Can you really claim that that's science? In other words, you take knowledge and you divorce it from wisdom? How can you possibly claim that you have science? What good do you contribute to human beings, to yourself, or to the world? Okay? So that, in brief, is a number of the things that I discussed. If you have any questions, what do you have to answer? That's one.
You talked earlier about Descartes' ideas with respect to the imagination. How do you think the role or the purpose of the imagination for human beings changed from the time of the Enlightenment onward?
Well, under the influence of this distrust of reason, the imagination becomes the principle from which that is chiefly identified with reason and practical reason, and because it retains an innocence, it's somewhat like Adam in the garden, in a state of innocence. So, to the extent that when the Enlightenment thinkers talk about pure reason, what they're really doing is talking about the imagination operating under Kant's notion of universal will, willing with pure will. And so they understand metaphysics to be more or less projections of the imagination. This is what Kant's three critiques are all about. Dreaming impossible dreams, so that you know the limits of your imagination, transcendental imagination, and so forth. So the poetic imagination really becomes the principle of you might say the formal difference of a human being, to the extent that you're acting under enlightenment. For example, in that definition I gave of science, it's very important. If you're Lord Monckton, don't go to the UN climate change meeting and claim that you hold a different view, because you only have a scientific view to the extent you can mathematically demonstrate what you're doing, and it's approved by a small number of beings, human beings, who establish the nominalistic understanding of what the truth is. We've entirely moved the liberal arts out of higher education as the handmaid to education, and we've replaced it with the notion of tolerance, being able to receive from the Illuminati what is the commonly received view that's hanging out in the Ivy League universities and in Brussels and so on. If we don't accept that, you can't be possessed of science. You're backward. You must be Catholic.
Professor, thank you again for coming. Peter actually, when he invited me to come to your talk here, he actually promised that you do demonstration of kata.
Oh yeah. Oh no, I wouldn't do kata. No.
But
not in Chavez. Can you comment really on the recent development in modern science? You mentioned something about modern understanding of how science is positivistic, right? It's positivism. And I guess nowadays in cosmology we have this understanding that our common sense universe constitutes like only 4% of the world of the universe that we know. The rest 96% is still dark matter, dark energy. We don't know what that is. And you have in in particle physics, all the smart scientists at CERN, they're just about a matter of verifying, the Gauss particle, right? The Higgs boson, boson, and all that. So, so this reality is with us, and you're making the remark that that this is a type of science that you produce knowledge, but not necessarily wisdom.
Right.
But you have this reality. Can you comment? What does metaphysics, from the Thomistic point of view, have to say about all this reality for us?
I think that if you, first of all, it gives you a better understanding of how sciences actually operate. The principles of science, of any science, are contained in definitions, right? Which constitutes the truth conditions within the science. For St. Thomas, the ancient physicist verifies judgments, because science concludes in judgments. And you saw at the same point, you're wondering about something, and you're wondering about opposition. You're wondering about something that you see that doesn't correspond to what you're thinking. And you're trying to figure out how do I explain this? Right? Now, if you think that the only way you can verify is by going out to your external senses, right? Well, that's what you do in physics, okay? In classical physics, and even if you're a mathematical physicist, you'll use that. But the uniqueness of contemporary physics is, and what the thinkers like Galileo and Newton started to recognize, was that you could understand and measure qualities and qualitative changes using mathematics, and that's how they developed the calculus to do this. But mathematicians, strictly speaking, can't study motion. The only way they can study is by stopping the race and plotting. And they do it in modern physics from a straight line and deviation from a straight line motion. But mathematicians verify in their imagination. Why? Because the quantity is not directly observable. It's not the formal object, the sense of sight, which is the chief intellectual sense. And for you to be able to hold together an understanding of something like a straight line, you have to use you have to remember, which for St. Thomas, strictly speaking, is what we call the imagination. You have to hold it together in your imagination. So that's why these mathematicians use models to verify things. That's strictly speaking not mathematical. That's not empirical verification. But in either case, what you're doing is you're taking a multitude. This is the point that I'm trying to get at. That the whole of philosophy of the ancient Greeks was a study of the one and the many. This was not a problem that was restricted to ancient physics. The notion that it was is a myth that comes out of the modern reinterpretation of classical philosophy to maintain that philosophy begins with the discovery of logic, when actually it preceded the discovery of logic. And the problem of the one and the many goes through from the ancient physicists. It's all throughout Plato. And Aristotle's metaphysics is chiefly studied the relationship between the one and the many, as is his understanding of what science involves, because science is a study of opposition. And according to Aristotle, the chief opposition is between a one and a many. And scientist any science studies a multitude of opposites within a genus. For example, politicians study war and peace. Physicians study health and disease. The economists study wealth and poverty. That's the subject matter. The relatively healthy body is the genus, okay, that the philosopher studies. The genus of the logician is not the genus of the philosopher, as St. Thomas says. It's different. Okay? It's the generating matter. The generating matter, to give an example, Socrates, I use Socrates. Galen, the physician, is the genus through which all the medical acts of Galen proceed, all the species of medical acts. He generates them. The notion of genus actually started, we got it from ancient physics. It wasn't from logic, it got transferred over into logic. So if you don't understand that, what the genus is of a science, you can't understand what analogy is all about, for example, and why analogy is essential to scientific reasoning. But you don't want to use it, strictly speaking. You want to use univocity. And how analogy is, strictly speaking, not about terms. As Father Maurer says in his work on William of Ockham, it's chiefly about judgments. Unequally relating a multitude to some chief subject that possesses what you're talking about in its form, like health chiefly exists in the human body. But you can talk about health books. You can talk about exercise being healthy and so forth. But the analogy is not about a term. It's about judgment that you make in the way a multitude is related to some chief subject that possesses something in a maximal way. So there again, the understanding of what the necessity of engaging in analogy, and how analogy is crucial to developing science is quite important. Yes?
Last question.
Okay.
Well, thinking about what you just said about the essentiality of analogy and then going back to St. Thomas, is the connection between science and wisdom so strong, just as a natural matter, that there's almost something natural within a human to say, I need to make a judgment about this. I mean, it's unavoidable. And so even for a sophist, I mean, you hear in the academy all the time, oh, well, we want to approach the subject without judgment. I mean, that cannot sustain.
Of course not. They engage in behavioral contradictions all the time in relationship to this. And they, when you get people who've reduced the whole of judgment where it relates to truth to just, Pope Benedict warns about this, in his Regensburg address, in his Catholic University address. How, if you are a secularized fundamentalist and you're holding on to this narrow view of reason, how are you going to talk to Muslims who think the same way you do? You need some kind of a trust in a natural reason, which you can consider to be in some way scientific, if you're going to engage with people in a conversation where you can get to agreements without war, without physical conflict. You get rid of the classical understanding of philosophy, and this becomes impossible. Now, I maintain that that philosophy and science both are concerned with the problem of the one and the many. I was lucky enough, I had an office with a Dominican priest by the name of Charles Bonaventure Crowley, who was a very impish guy, and he was working for 50 years on trying to show how all of the principles that are used in modern physical sciences are analogous transpositions of the principle of unity and its properties that are contained in Aristotle's Metaphysics. Now, Father Crowley I was not interested in physical science at all. I loved geometry, but then I was working on other stuff, and he came down with spinal arthritis and couldn't figure out how to do this work, and the work lacked total unity. I mean, the work was a mess. The Dominicans in the Dominican House of Studies didn't want to touch it. To look. I said, look, I'll fix it. Just publish it, okay? So he writes this work called The Aristotelian Thomistic Philosophy of Measure and the International System of Units, SI. Then there's a subtitle to it, which I won't even go through. but he shows me, the whole of physical science is a study of the relationship between a one and a many, and all of the principles are mathematical principles showing how mathematicians to start to reason about these differences that they notice, and conflicts that they notice. So I got from Crowley, oh wow, that's the one in the many in the thing over there. Right? And I got from Father Maurer the notion that science is, strictly speaking, for St. Thomas, not a system of body and knowledge, but it's a habit of the mind. And I said, well, I got to get Crowley to talk to Maurer over here and put them together. Right? And then I got to put them together with St. Thomas over here and have both of them talk to St. Thomas and have St. Thomas talk to Plato over here. And then you can, if you put all of those people together, like St. Bernard of Chartres says, you stand on the shoulders of giants, and what you can come up with is a metaphysical foundation for a new understanding of science, which will enable physicists to liberate themselves from this kind of, as well as philosophers, from this kind of narrow understanding which restricts the way that they can practice their activity. And that's what they'll have to do if there are to be any more volumes in this series that I'm doing.
Thank you so much, Liz.